In this video, we will be replacing the transmission fluid and filter in this 2003 Toyota Camry. To prep this vehicle, I have installed rhino ramps under the front tires. I have safety stands just in case the rhino ramps fail. I have wheel chocks behind the rear tires, and I have set the parking brake. Taking a look underneath the car towards the rear of the vehicle, we want to focus our attention on the driver's side portion. And taking a look, we can clearly see our transmission pan and drain plug. We also have a front shroud that we will end up removing a little bit later. And our drain plug will be using a 10mm Allen head wrench, so we can keep that in mind as well. And we will use a 10mm socket for the bolts going around our transmission pan. We will keep this in mind as well. Because we are completely flushing out this system, we're going to be using Amsoil engine and transmission flush. I am installing this into the transmission dipstick location. I'm then going to idle the vehicle for 10 to 15 minutes. And while it's idling, I will be shifting through all of the various gears all the way down and then all the way back up a couple times. This will help that product work throughout the entire transmission and breaking apart any sludge buildup that is in the engine. And while the engine is idling, I will set up a drip pan where I can measure the amount of fluid that comes out. I can also set up any other tools that I need. And this oil will be hot, so you will want to have a good pair of gloves to protect your hands. And I've also put a drip pan underneath my collection container, just because it can get messy sometimes. I think I'll actually just let it drain just like that for a while till most of the fluid comes out. This fluid is looking very black. And no, this is not the engine oil. This is the transmission fluid. And after letting a good portion of the fluid drain out, we can very carefully remove the plug. Now this is holding back a fair amount of fluid still, and that fluid is hot, so you do want to be aware of that. And we can take our reading as well. So we have pulled out almost exactly 4 quarts of transmission oil. And interestingly enough, our initial fill is right at about 4 quarts. So in theory, if all we did is drain the fluid out of the plug, put the plug back in and refill it, we would only be replacing about 4 quarts. However, we can also see that the total fill is more along the lines of about 9 quarts. So we still have about 5 quarts of fluid in this system. We're going to go ahead and let this drain for a little while. And temporarily I'm going to put this plug back in so it doesn't splash all over me. I'll be using a 10mm socket as well as a combination wrench to get access to a few of these. I'm going to jump around just a little bit so I'm not going in a complete circle. Now we do have decent access to most of the bolts. However, the most problematic bolts are the ones that sit partially underneath the frame of the vehicle. For this, I'm using a combination wrench to get those loose. And removing the driver's side front shroud will help give us access to some of those front bolts. And we will also need this removed for a later procedure when we are actually flushing new transmission fluid through the entire system. And that gives us much better access to those front bolts. So at this point I have all of the bolts removed except 2, one on either end of the pan. These bolts are loose and they are essentially just holding it to make sure that the pan doesn't fall. However, the pan shouldn't fall because it is probably stuck up inside the engine because it's been on there for so long. There are about 4 bolts on the back side of this that are very difficult to get to because of the frame. I was able to remove all of these with a variety of 1/4 inch drive sockets, 3/8 inch drive sockets, and 10mm combination wrenches. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the plug, take out the last 2 bolts, and gently work that pan off, keeping in mind that there is probably still a bit of fluid in the pan. And I'll add the remaining oil that came out of the bottom of the pan to what we have already collected. So we are sitting at about 5 quarts of oil. This number is important for the purpose of refilling the system before we flush out the system. Our objective at this point is to clean the pan as good as we can. Additionally, we need to remove the existing gasket around the edge of the pan. And we do have a couple magnets that we need to clean off as well. This gasket has been on there for probably 241,000 miles and about 20 years. It is very crusty and is coming off in pieces. I will make sure to come back with some acetone and clean up this mating surface as best as I possibly can. The magnets can then be installed, and I can see if my new gasket is going to fit properly on my existing pan. This one's looking good. Taking a look underneath the vehicle, I can see my transmission filter clearly. There is 3 10mm bolts holding this in. This is the next thing we need to remove. And I started by just breaking these free, and then I came back with the ratchet to remove them the rest of the way. And be aware that there is a little bit of fluid sitting behind that filter, so you will want your drip pan in place. And we can take a look at our old filter compared to our new filter. We want to make sure everything looks the same and lines up. These look pretty good. Now I did notice that my new filter has a rubber ring, and if I take a look at the old filter, there is no rubber ring. So I need to check in the engine to make sure that it isn't stuck up inside of there. And I do not see any rubber ring up there. Perhaps it fell in the pan. And I do see that it made its way into the pan, so we're looking pretty good. I will add this fluid to the total of the fluid I removed already. This puts my total removed just over 5 quarts. And before installing this, I am going to put just a little bit of new transmission fluid on this rubber ring. And then we can install the filter and start our bolts. Make sure these bolts are started by hand first to prevent cross-threading them. If you wiggle the filter around a little bit, sometimes they go in just a little easier. Now, although I could not find the torque specs through the manufacturer's website, I did find another site that said these should be torqued to 8 foot-pounds. And before we install our newly cleaned pan, we do want to use a little acetone and make sure that the mating surface is nice and clean. If there is any gasket material, you'll want to clean that off. And to hold this gasket in place so it doesn't move around, I'm going to start about every other bolt. And on the far side, which sits kind of right where the frame is, I'm going to install all of these, and hopefully it'll make it a little bit easier to reinstall on the vehicle. And we can then proceed with reinstalling the pan and starting a couple bolts. And I just want to start these a few threads. I'll go around and start each of these and then add my remaining bolts so that every hole is filled. And these bolts will then be torqued to 69 inch-pounds. Now I am going to jump around a little bit and not go in a circle. The goal is to apply even pressure around the entire perimeter of the pan. And then our drain plug gets torqued to 36 foot-pounds. With our filter replaced, the new gasket installed, our drain pan on, and everything torqued, I'm going to add 5 quarts of transmission fluid. This is the same amount that I measured that I took out. And I will be installing Amsoil multi-vehicle 100% synthetic automatic transmission fluid. And 1 additional quart will bring us up to 5 quarts. Now we're not quite done yet. We still want to flush out any remaining old fluid that may be anywhere else in the system. And if you remember, there is a high probability that there is at least an additional 4 more quarts in the system. I'm going to dump my old fluid that I've collected back into my now empty containers. This will be sent off to be recycled or whatever they do with it. And the goal is that I'm going to start my count over. Found my Allen wrench. Shifting our focus back to the engine bay, we want to look down directly in front of the engine, just behind the radiator, all the way down. And taking a look down, we can see 2 transmission fluid lines. These run into and out of our cooler. We want to pull the line on the driver's side portion right down by the bottom. And we'll put a drip pan underneath just in case we get some residual fluid to come out. Using a length of hose of the same diameter. This hose having an outside diameter of 0.67 and an inside diameter of 3/8 or 0.375. We're going to feed that line on there. And the other end of the line I'm going to zip tie onto my collection bucket. So the objective is, when I turn on the vehicle, the transmission is going to be pumping the fluid. That fluid that it is pumping is going to come out this line that I added into my collection bucket. The problem is, I don't want to run out of transmission fluid in the transmission, so I'm going to be adding transmission fluid as this is pumping it out. And the goal is that the rate at which the fluid is coming out is the same as the rate at which I am adding fluid. That's the goal. Additionally, what I am looking for is potentially dirty fluid changing into that nice translucent red clean color. And I'm going to start by pumping through about 1 gallon of fluid and then check the quality of the fluid coming out of the line to see if I need to continue this procedure. And after 1 full gallon had been pumped through, the fluid still looked very dirty coming out of the hose. So I decided to do an additional 2 quarts and check it again. And after the additional 2 quarts, it looked pretty good and this might have been fine. However, I wanted to make sure all of the old fluid was out. Okay. So after running 6 additional quarts of fluid through, I wasn't fully happy with the color, so I again refilled my bottles, set them aside, got an extra gallon, ran an additional 4 quarts through, and after that, about second to third quart, it was looking really nice. I ran 1 additional quart, and I'm pretty happy with the way this turned out. Perfect. That started coming out nice and clean. So we can go ahead and switch our lines back. And we can replace our dipstick. And we can clean everything up, back it off the rhino ramps. With the vehicle parked on a level surface and the engine running, we want to check the transmission fluid dipstick and adjust our level accordingly. And if we take a close look at our reading, we can see that we are just towards the bottom end of the cool zone on our dipstick. I'll go ahead and add just a little bit more transmission fluid just to top it off. I do like to be in the middle to a little bit on the upper end of that zone.